It started innocently enough. I was reading on the bed while my boyfriend Charlie was playing on the computer with his friends. I don't play many games, so it's interesting to listen to the things he says, even if terminology goes way over my head sometimes. There will be moments when I'll be focusing on something, and he'll just spout off words that sound extraterrestrial. I'll just laugh it off and continue with what I was doing. It wasn't my thing, but he enjoyed it, and it wasn't hurting anyone, initially. Like I said, I had my nose between the pages, reading about various armchair philosophies, as Charlie raved in the background, playing Call of Duty, I think. He had won a match and swiveled his armchair to face me, like a dog when they did a trick right. "Finally got a win tonight," he exclaimed, more for himself than for me. "That's great, babe," I replied, offering an admittedly false smile. I was happy he was happy, but I can't say I was invested. He turned back to the computer and talked to his friends again. They were hyping each other up. I heard Charlie mutter, "Now that was Poggers." It was such a random word that it tickled my brain when I heard it, and I couldn't help but laugh. Charlie leaned back in his chair, as if he was exhausted himself, as he swiveled to face me once more. "I can't believe I just said that unironically." He echoed my laughter, offering a painfully adorable smile. "I feel like I should wash my mouth out with soap." He repeated the word a few times, making sure to let out popping noises when mouthing the P. We both laughed it off, and he said goodnight to his friends. It was time for me to get some quality time with him, and with that, my book remained on the nightstand until morning. In the morning, I woke up early and felt like I had gotten a really good sleep. So, I was in a good mood, and when I'm in a good mood, I make breakfast. I heard the stairs creak and figured the smell of bacon had lifted Charlie out of bed. He stumbled into the kitchen, his hair a complete mess. "That smells like Poggers," he groggily moaned. With wild amusement, I went to laugh. Charlie's face conveyed confusion as he stood in the kitchen, his eyes strained and mouth still slightly agape. "I totally meant to say great," he continued, turning his gaze to me. "God, I'm tired," he chuckled before shuffling over to me to help finish up with breakfast. The rest of the day was pretty normal. We even decided to go on a little impromptu date, the best we could do with the world the way it is. But when we were winding down for the night, getting ready to brush our teeth, Charlie informed me that today was Poggers, babe. I politely replied that if he was trying to mess with me, it was going to get old, fast. He shook his head. "It just kind of came out. Sorry," he said, raising the toothbrush and dragging it across his teeth. We both brushed our teeth, and in unison spit into the sink. As I was wiping my mouth, I could see Charlie leaning in for a kiss. I turned my head, but when I met him face to face, I smelled something putrid climbing into my nostrils. It was enough to make me recoil away from him. It was like battery acid poured over rotting roast beef. I instinctively put my hand over my nose. "Your breath is awful," I told him, which we both knew was odd. He just brushed his teeth, and it's not like he had gingivitis or anything. He went to point out as much by pointing to the sink, but stopped. I followed his cue and looked into the sink, where he had spit toothpaste out. On my side of the sink, there were a few lingering bubbles. On his side of the sink, however, still clinging to the white porcelain, was a thick and frothy substance. It was a sickly yellow with streaks of red that would suggest Charlie's dental hygiene had degraded significantly in just one night. He quickly reached over and turned the faucet on. Opening his mouth, he checked out the condition of his teeth. They looked completely fine. It took a good bit of water for the mess he had spit into the sink to budge at all. Eventually, with the convincing of steaming hot water, it disappeared. I went to say something to him, but he was captivated by his reflection, with his mouth moving ever so slightly. His lips quietly repeated the P sound over and over. I told him that we should just go to bed, and we'll make an appointment to see the dentist to make sure something weird wasn't going on with the bacteria or something. We made our way to be settled down for the night. With the lights turned off and the dark of a sleeping world creeping in, I closed my eyes. I don't know how long I was asleep for, but I awoken slowly by a small prodding on my shoulder. Charlie was ever so gently poking me, like a child who wants their parents to wake up on Christmas, but is afraid to make them angry. I shuffled my body, still coming out of the throes of deep sleep. My body was sluggish, and the blankets felt like they weighed 30 pounds. As I turned over, I reached behind me to flick on the light, and the sudden brightness momentarily stunned my vision. I started wiping my eyes and was about to ask what was wrong when a very familiar and pungent smell assaulted my senses again. It was worse this time, like it had been sitting for a while. I struggled to keep my urge to vomit subdued. This was made all the more difficult when I moved to brace my new position and felt my fingers pressed against the sheets. As my fingers pressed down, a hot and vicious liquid rose from the divots I had made. Then I saw Charlie. His face had that sickly yellow shit caked onto his face. He looked like an infant that had fought hard against eating his own baby formula. His mouth was moving, and words were coming out, but just barely. His voice was raspy. I could tell they were painful. His body would tremble every time he started to speak. Such a horrid sight, watching each letter accompanied by a small spittle of the disgusting liquid, and before long, I could see how it was about to get worse. As he kept going, Poggers. I could see thin trails of smoke lifting from inside his mouth and under his lip. Horrified, I hadn't moved my hands yet, but once the new drippings had made their way to my hand, I could feel an intense burning sensation. Charlie started to shake more violently as I finally snapped to my senses and ran to the phone. Dialing 911 as fast as I could, I heard Charlie behind me beginning to shout, "Poggers," over and over. I could just imagine the molten ooze spewing from his mouth like Yellowstone as he attempted to clear his mouth of the heat. I didn't know what to even say to the operator, so I told the lady he had severe burns and trouble breathing. Keeping the phone off the hook, as the operator confirmed that an ambulance was on the way, I made my way back to Charlie. It was so much worse than I had first saw. The blankets on the bed where he was facing away from me were soaked. The liquid had saturated the sheets and the bed to the point that they were dripping onto the hard wood. Plumes of smoke rose from the hard wood, threatening to bore right through the floor, but it wasn't my biggest concern. I couldn't help but picture Charlie laying there all night, saying that stupid word over and over, suffering but not wanting to disturb me. He looked so weak. I don't know what that fluid was, but it was taking all the nutrients Charlie needed to function with it. The whites of his eyes were beginning to stain yellow, like a smoker's walls, and his skin was so visibly dry, I thought he was going to start molting. I barely recognized the man that I knew as he rose from the bed, shambling to his feet. It looked like some cheesy zombie flick, with a small budget, but seeing it in person, happening to someone I loved, was so painful and scary. I started to worry about my safety as he got closer to me, the same yellow substance dripping from his slack jaw. His eyes were so different. I felt as though he couldn't even see me. He was just heading towards something. Poggers. A whisper came from his mouth. Well-formed letters, unfettered by the slob dwelling in his mouth. The voice was so ethereal, it didn't even sound like Charlie anymore. Before Charlie closed in, I saw the sanctity of blue and red lights flashing beyond our bedroom window. Quickly I ran to the front door, letting paramedics in and trying to explain to them what was going on. As we headed back up the stairs, Charlie looked so weak, but it took the three of them to subdue him as he fought back. His grotesque saliva burned holes in their clothing, though I don't think they noticed. They made it apparent that I wasn't allowed to go with them, as they loaded him on the back of the ambulance. As they drove away, leaving me to my own devices, I could see one of the paramedics pressing a needle into Charlie's neck. And that was that. He was gone. I was left, standing there all alone in the dark. Eventually, I made it back up the stairs and started cleaning up the mess. Luckily, the piles of vial no longer burned on contact, though the texture was still enough to make me wince. I didn't think there was a point washing anything, so I just pulled the bed with its covers out to the alleyways and rested them against the garage. I didn't sleep that night, was so out of it I almost didn't hear the phone ringing. Someone from the hospital telling me I could visit. I was there in no time. While looking at Charlie, who was still pretty heavily sedated but conscious, I asked the doctor if Charlie had said anything yet. The doctor said it would be difficult for Charlie to speak, as he had chewed through his tongue during his night there. Looking at my boyfriend, I could see that even under sedation, his jaw was moving up and down. His lips pursed and contorted as if trying to speak. However, with the drugs and the lack of a tongue, all that came out of his mouth were small whistles of air. As I stared at Charlie, I heard something behind me, a commotion caused by another person being rushed into the ER. Turning around, I saw one of the paramedics that had helped Charlie get into the ambulance, rushing down the hall. So many people were talking at once, and I'm sure I must have been the only one to hear it. The ambulance drivers speaking low under the mutter of voices and the chaos of chirping machinery.